Hungary remembers being occupied. For roughly 150 years, it lived under the Ottoman Empire, a wound its leaders have never let the country forget. So in 2015, when hundreds of thousands of migrants from Muslim-majority nations moved north across its land, Viktor Orban did not hesitate. Europe's identity, he said, is rooted in Christianity, and Hungary did not want a large number of Muslim people. He raised fences, criminalized those who helped asylum seekers, and dared the European Union to stop him. To his critics, he was a tyrant. To his voters, a prophet. Why did Hungary go this far? To understand that question, you have to stand on a railway platform in Budapest in the late summer of 2015. At Keleti station, thousands of families are camped on the stone floor, waiting for trains west that never come. Children sleep under thin foil blankets. Volunteers move between them with water and bread. For a few strange weeks, the face of the largest migration since the Second World War is not a boat in the Mediterranean, but this crowded terminal in the heart of a small, Central European capital. None of these people want to be here. Every one of them is trying to reach Germany. When the government halted the westbound trains, the crowd at Keleti did not wait. In early September, thousands of people simply began to walk, setting off along the M1 motorway toward the Austrian border. A long column of families and suitcases moving down the hard shoulder of a European highway. The pictures were extraordinary, and they forced the issue. Within days, Hungary put buses on to carry the marchers to the frontier, and Austria and Germany, for a brief window, let them cross. For a moment, it looked like compassion winning.
But inside the Hungarian government, the lesson drawn was the opposite one, that as long as the doors stayed open, the people would keep coming, and the numbers would never stop on their own. The crisis did not begin in Hungary. It began far to the south, in the ruins of Syria, in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the broken cities of Iraq. War and collapse pushed millions toward the sea, most crossing from Turkey to the Greek islands, and from the islands, a single road bent north. It ran through Macedonia and Serbia, and it ended at the southern edge of a landlocked country of fewer than 10 million people. Hungary sat at the narrowest point of the funnel, the first state of the passport-free Schengen zone on the road to the wealthy north. To reach Berlin, you first had to cross Budapest. The scale is difficult to picture. Over the course of that year, the International Organization for Migration recorded more than 411,000 irregular crossings into Hungary, close to 400,000 people, second only to Greece in the entire European Union. Through June, July, and August, the daily average climbed by roughly 447% to around 1,500 arrivals a day. By September, the figure had exploded. On some days, more than 7,000 people crossed the southern frontier. 7,000 in 24 hours, into a country the size of a mid-sized American state. The law only sharpened the pressure. Under the European Union's own Dublin rules, asylum seekers were supposed to be registered in the first member state they reached. On paper, that made Budapest responsible for fingerprinting, housing, and processing a flood it had no capacity to hold. In practice, almost no one wanted to be registered in Hungary at all.
Every hour spent there was an hour stolen from the journey to Germany, and so the crowds pressed on, refusing to stop. While the system built to receive them buckled, who were they? Around half came from Syria, fleeing a civil war that had already killed hundreds of thousands. The rest came mostly from Afghanistan and Iraq. Across the Union that year, Syrians lodged nearly 370,000 asylum applications, Afghans about 190,000, Iraqis more than 125,000. In total, a record of roughly 1.3 million people sought asylum in Europe. The overwhelming majority came from Muslim-majority nations, from faiths and cultures most Hungarians had never lived beside in the modern age. That single detail, almost lost in the noise, would shape everything that followed. Here the story splits from the rest of the continent. In Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel opened the doors.
Wir schaffen das, she said. We can do this. Crowds in Munich applauded the arriving trains. Across much of Western Europe, the mood was welcome, or at least duty. But in Budapest, the government looked at the same platforms and reached the opposite conclusion. Where Berlin saw a humanitarian obligation, Hungary's leaders saw a loss of control, and they began to speak less of refugees and more of an uncontrolled flood, of security, of borders that had stopped meaning anything. Brussels, meanwhile, was paralyzed. Its own rules had loaded the shock onto Greece, Italy, and Hungary, while the migrants themselves simply walked north. The proposed answer was a quota system, distributing the arrivals across every member state, by compulsion if necessary. To Hungary, this was not a rescue, but an instruction from outside, a foreign body telling a sovereign nation how many strangers it must take in.
The seed of open rebellion was planted in that single demand. For Viktor Orban, the summer clarified everything. He refused to treat the crisis as a passing emergency to be managed with patience and compassion. He framed it instead as a civilizational test, a question of whether Europe would remain what it had always been. As early as September, standing before journalists in Brussels, he said that Europeans had the right to decide that they did not want a large number of Muslim people in their countries. It was a sentence that would echo for years, damned across half the continent and quietly welcomed across the other half. But it did not come from nowhere. It rose out of a particular reading of history, of geography, and of what a small nation on the rim of a great empire believes it must do to survive.
To understand the wall that was about to close the border, you first have to understand the memory buried beneath it. That memory reaches back to the 16th century. For roughly 150 years, much of Hungary lay under Ottoman rule, its central plains governed from distant Constantinople, its people caught between two empires. In the story Hungarians tell about themselves, they were the bleeding frontier that held the line so that Christian Europe behind them could survive. Orban reached for exactly this. When it comes to living together with Muslim communities, he said that September, we are the only ones with the experience, because we lived through it for 150 years. Historians may argue with the comparison, but it gave his position an enormous emotional charge. In his telling, this was never a policy dispute. It was the newest chapter of a very old war. So Hungary built. All summer, crews had been racing to raise a barrier along the Serbian border, and on the 15th of September 2015, they finished it and sealed the frontier. What they built was a 175-kilometer fence in 2 layers, a low coil of razor wire, and behind it, a taller wall of steel and mesh standing around 3 meters high. New laws turned crossing it into a crime. Police and soldiers moved south, and when the human river simply swung west toward Croatia, Hungary began a second fence along that border too. Every door was closing at once. To hold the line, the government hardened everything behind the wire. It later recruited thousands of new officers, the so-called order hunters, and handed the army broad powers along the frontier. Crossing the fence was no longer a bureaucratic irregularity, but a criminal act, pushed through fast-track courts set up for the purpose, and returns back into Serbia became routine.
The message to anyone still on the road was impossible to misread. This door is shut, and it will be defended. The result was almost impossible to believe. In September and October, daily arrivals had regularly passed 7,000. By November and December, with the fences complete and the route severed, the average number of people reaching Hungary each day fell to around 10. 10. A corridor that had carried the largest migration in modern European history was, from Hungary's side, simply switched off. The flow did not disappear, it was pushed onto other countries and other borders. But as far as Budapest was concerned, control had returned, and a nation of under 10 million had done what the whole machinery of the European Union could not. Orban's case went far beyond fences and numbers. In the years that followed, he built an entire worldview around that autumn. Europe's identity, he insisted, is rooted in Christianity, and mass immigration from another civilization threatened to dissolve it. Migrants, he argued, had been raised in a different religion and carried a radically different culture. In a speech in March of 2018, he warned that becoming an immigrant country would bring terrorism and crime, would put Hungarian women in danger, and would cause the nation's identity to weaken and slowly evaporate. He spoke of a conspiracy, naming the European Union and the financier George Soros as the authors of a plan, as he put it, to Muslimize the continent. The state pushed the message everywhere. Giant government billboards rose along the roads, carrying blunt warnings about immigration, jobs, and safety, until no citizen could drive to work without being told exactly where the government stood. It was propaganda on a national scale, and by every measure that mattered to Orban, it worked. For the people who reached the wire, the rhetoric was abstract, but the steel was not. Families who had crossed a sea and walked the length of the Balkans arrived at the border and found it shut. At a crossing near Roska, some tried to force their way through and were met with tear gas and water cannon. The footage traveled the world, and Hungary's name split in two. In much of Western Europe, it became a symbol of cruelty, a country that had chosen wire over welcome. In Central Europe, and among a rising share of voters further west, it became something else entirely. Proof that a determined government could take back its own frontier, whatever Brussels said. Then Orban turned a border policy into a national verdict. In 2016, he called a referendum, asking Hungarians whether they rejected the European Union's plan to resettle migrants across member states by mandatory quota, without the consent of their parliament. It was, in effect, a vote on the entire meaning of the crisis. Who decides who enters Hungary, Hungarians or Europe? The answer was crushing and, at the same time, legally empty. On the 2nd of October, more than 3.3 million people voted to reject the quotas, against only around 55,000 who supported them, a margin near 98%. But turnout reached only about 40%, short of the 50% the law required to make the result binding. By the letter of the rules, the referendum was invalid. Orban did not care. He declared a resounding political victory and treated the millions of rejecting ballots as a mandate, pointing out
that even a failed referendum had drawn more votes against the quotas than his government had won in a general election. From there, the course was fixed. The fence was no longer an emergency measure, but permanent policy, hardened in law and blessed by a national vote, however contested. The quarrel with the European Union was no longer about one chaotic summer. It had become a defining struggle over sovereignty, over identity, over the right of a small country to decide who belonged inside its walls. And Orban, rather than softening under the pressure, was preparing to go further still, to carve his hard line directly into the criminal code, and to measure exactly how much defiance the Union would tolerate. In June of 2018, the Hungarian parliament passed a package of laws the government proudly branded Stop Soros. Named after the financier Orban had cast as the architect of mass migration, it turned his rhetoric into criminal statute. Now it was an offense to help a migrant who had entered the country illegally to claim asylum or apply to stay. Lawyers, volunteers, and aid workers who assisted an undocumented person could face up to a year in prison. The law reached further, narrowing the right to asylum itself, letting Hungary reject any application from a person who had passed through a country deemed safe on the way in. Since nearly everyone arrived overland through Serbia, the rule was built to make asylum on Hungarian soil almost impossible. Behind the law stood the transit zones, rows of fenced containers on the Serbian border where asylum seekers were held while their cases were weighed. In practice, people could be confined there for months, unable to step into Hungary and unable to leave except by walking back into Serbia. Budapest called it border management. Human rights groups called it detention. And slowly, the machinery of European law began to turn against Hungary. The European Commission took the government to court, and in November of 2021, the Court of Justice of the European Union handed down its verdict. The Stop Soros law, it ruled, breached European law, criminalizing those who helped asylum seekers, violated rights guaranteed under the Union's own directives. Separately, the judges found that automatically rejecting claims from people who had crossed a safe transit country was unlawful, and that the detention and pushbacks at the border ran against Hungary's obligations. On paper, Hungary had lost. Its signature policy had been declared illegal by the highest court on the continent. Yet on the ground, the ruling changed almost nothing. By the time the judges spoke, the fence had already stood for 6 years, and the route was long since dead. Stranger still, the countries that had once condemned Hungary were now raising walls of their own. By the time Luxembourg called the Hungarian law illegal, fences had become almost ordinary along the edges of Europe, from the Evros River between Greece and Turkey to the cold forests of the Polish frontier with Belarus. The very measures that had made Hungary a pariah in 2015 were, within a few short years, being copied by the same governments that had shouted loudest against it. The mood on the continent had shifted, and much of it had shifted in Orban's direction. Leaders who had elected him now borrowed his language of controlled borders and protected frontiers. The outsider had, improbably, become the template. This is the paradox at the center of Hungary's hard line. Measured against the law of the Union, it was a chain of violations. Measured against its own stated goal, it was a success. The flow was stopped, the borders held, and the government that built the wall kept winning elections. To his critics, Orban had traded away compassion, the rule of law, and Hungary's standing in Europe for the cheap fuel of fear. To his supporters, he had done the single thing a leader is elected to do. He had guarded the nation, and he had been proven right while the rest of Europe slowly caught up. So why did Hungary take the hardest line of all? The answer is not only in the summer of 2015, the 400,000 crossings, the 7,000 arrivals in a day. It reaches back to that older wound, to the 150 years under the Ottomans, to a country that has always seen itself as a small Christian frontier on the rim of something larger and stronger. When the migrants came, overwhelmingly from Muslim-majority lands, Hungary's leaders did not read it as a purely humanitarian event. They read it as history returning, the frontier being tested once again. Whether that reading was wisdom or paranoia depends entirely on where you stand. There is a harder truth beneath the politics. Hungary is a shrinking country. Its population is aging and falling, and its labor shortages are real. The economically rational cure for such a decline is immigration, and Orban rejected that cure out loud, insisting that Hungary would not fix its demographic crisis with migrants, that it would sooner stay itself and grow smaller than change its face and grow larger. It was a deliberate choice of identity over economics, of continuity over expansion, made in full view of the price. Today, the fence still runs along the southern border, quiet now, patrolled but rarely tested. The trains at Keleti keep their timetables, the crowds are gone, and the crisis that once filled every screen has thinned into memory. But the questions it raised have not thinned at all. Does a nation have the right to decide who enters it, even against the will of the union it belongs to? Where does the duty to shelter strangers end and the right to preserve a culture begin? And who in the end gets to answer? The courts of Europe or the voters of a single country?
Hungary chose its answer years ago, and it has not moved. A small nation looked at the largest migration in modern European history, remembered its own long war on the frontier, and decided that survival meant saying no. The rest of the continent is still arguing whether that was a betrayal of European values or their last hard-edged defense. 30 years from now, when the story of this era is finally written, only time will tell which it was.